Hi, I'm Luc. I'm an artist and I'm a big fan of horror games.
I'm Jem. I'm a programmer at Free Lives. I like designing games and I like horror games.
And today we're going to be talking about horror in video games. What makes them scary and what makes us play scary games at all.
Yeah, why do we like these things that terrify the shit out of us and make us feel really uncomfortable all the time?
I don't know about you, Jem, but I'm a big fan of horror games. I play horror games almost exclusively. Why do we play the scary games that we play, and what makes certain games that may not be as scary as others stand out in my memory?
Early forms of entertainment where it was very much like this thrill ride, adrenaline-seeking sort of thing. Horror is one of the few genres in games and film, I think, that can kind of give us this very visceral reaction, this really like gut-wrenching chemical reaction inside our bodies that's quite intense.
When I think about the horror games that stick in my mind for years and years and years, there's kind of three major names that come to mind. And some of them aren't scary, but are fun, and some of them are unbelievably scary and not fun at all. And those games are like Resident Evil, which is not very scary, Resident Evil 4 specifically. It's not very scary, but it's a lot of fun. And then Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which was not fun, but was really scary. And I think both of them are successful games. And I just want to get a sense of like, why were they so different and why were the impacts so different? Why do we gravitate towards both of those games?
People like all kinds of different horror. And I mean, Amnesia, one of Amnesia's things when it came out was it felt like sort of almost torturing yourself. People would say how they play for about half an hour at a time, and that's about all they could manage. It became enjoyable because of how unpleasant it was, kind of thing, and how like deeply uncomfortable it made you feel. Whereas Resident Evil then I think probably relies a bit more on like the actual setting as being creepy. There are a couple of good jump scares in there, right?
Yeah.
But it's this thing we were talking about earlier too, between like vulnerability and having power in horror games versus versus having none and being completely vulnerable. So in Amnesia, you're completely vulnerable. And yeah, I mean, every encounter with the creature you see is like you can't even look at it. You have to like hide in shadows. You're completely worthless. You can't attack it. And I think you brought up an interesting point earlier when there comes a point in Resident Evil, I think you were saying, where it tips and it becomes absurd. You become a bit too powerful or something.
Yeah, so one of the things that I love about the way that Resident Evil 4 does horror is that when you first approach the setting, it takes itself with the utmost seriousness. I mean, there's a lot of absurdity, specifically in a scene where the character like is in this medieval town and all these villagers with axes and everything have just like left at the beckon of a bell and left you alone in this little village, and your character like spreads his arms wide and goes like, where's everyone gone? Bingo. So Resident Evil 4 is a cool game because while the atmosphere takes itself very, very seriously, the lead character doesn't at all. And I think that that's a perfect tone for a horror game like Resident Evil, which gives you a lot of power, because at some point in time, the character isn't going to be taking the horror seriously because they're powerful.
Yeah.
And other games that have come after Resident Evil 4 seem to have taken on that, not taken on that model. Games like The Evil Within and The Evil Within 2 take their horror with the utmost seriousness at all times. And the character is this very dour, very serious character, but oftentimes the game is absurd or silly. And the tone of the horror and the tone of the combat are like totally not in congruence with one another. Which is something that I actually think that Resident Evil 4 does really well, and Amnesia: The Dark Descent, because in Amnesia there's no point where the tone is at mismatch with what you're expected to do. If we have to distill like on a mechanical level, what mechanics are scary? In Resident Evil 4, like none of the mechanics are scary. The setting and the atmosphere is scary. Whereas in Amnesia there are like deliberately scary mechanics, which is you got this tinderbox that you need to light your lantern, and that's always running out. Also, if you stare at the monster, you get a screen effect that makes it harder to navigate the environment. This is horror embedded in the mechanics of the game, which I think is an interesting place for horror to come through. And I think very, very few games really utilize their mechanics to affect horror.
Like I sort of don't believe you can have one or the other. It's very tempting to think you can do something where you give the player like really finite resources and make like really heap on the mechanical kind of tension. But then like your settings like crap or whatever and not scary at all.
What I dislike when games do that is that mechanically hamstringing characters is fine, but it feels more frustrating than it does scary. Resident Evil 4 had the effect where when you aimed, you had to stand still. And I actually liked this because at that point in time, controllers weren't as sophisticated as they are now. It also forced you to consider your placement in the world when you took aim and shot at enemies. So it was about positioning yourself as much as it was about fighting the enemies. And I think that was such a cool mechanic to have because suddenly, if you choose to place yourself badly, you put yourself at risk, and that kind of ramps up a little bit of that tension in the combat. In games nowadays where we're used to a certain amount of responsiveness in our control schemes because we've played games that are like very, very responsive. So you can't take a gamer who's used to a Call of Duty, who's used to a Gears of War, and put them in the context of a Evil Within or Resident Evil 7 and not have them be slightly frustrated because those games are needlessly annoying to play in the sense that like Resident Evil 7 has extremely slow aiming. The gun doesn't feel good to shoot at all. And some people would argue that is a goal of the design, but it doesn't like feel like a good goal of the design of the game.
Yeah. I think at least with Resident Evil, it kind of makes sense in the world. It's possible that somebody might stop and aim carefully. Although I mean, it's a bit ridiculous that your characters are always these trained military kind of people most of the time. But then things like Silent Hill 2, which has like fantastic atmosphere. But I think a lot of the Silent Hill series has always been criticized for just being frustrating in terms of like slow combat swings and that sort of thing, and just like bad sluggish controls, which is I think quite different to Amnesia, where you're just not given any of those controls at all. Whereas you're given something that like nobody would swing a pole that slowly under any level of distress. They might swing a pole and like miss or fumble or something.
Bringing up the Silent Hill series is really interesting because Silent Hill 2, which is the Silent Hill that people often bring up, one, when it came out, it didn't feel as dated as it does now. So in retrospect, when we look at the success of Silent Hill 2, one of the things that made that game successful was like an unbelievably creepy atmosphere and this really good writing that
storytelling
made the player feel uncomfortable, not because of the monsters, but because of their implications. I think that Silent Hill as a series, as it aged, didn't change its gameplay style. And that kind of like frustrating over-the-shoulder melee combat against horror enemies really didn't age well with the series.
And they also just followed that thing of Silent Hill being so popular that they kept diverging off similar lines that didn't always fit the particular Silent Hill game that they were going for.
After Silent Hill 4, the series has gone on a path where you constantly revisit the town and the monsters just get like more and more high fidelity, but without the kind of terror that we see in these monsters when we don't understand them. Because now like we've got a pretty good appreciation of like unbelievably grotesque horror monsters. We've seen a lot of them in games from Dead Space to the Silent Hill series to the Resident Evils. So like body horror in video games is ever present. So it's not just enough to put like another really creepy body horror abomination.
Another nurse.
Another nurse. We need to understand why that thing is scary, especially to us as a player, and that's something that the system needs to communicate.
That does segue onto something I was thinking about in terms of like film and stuff. And just settings, creepy settings and eerie settings in games and film that subtly freak you out without you quite knowing why. The one that comes to mind for me is It Follows, the film It Follows, where you sort of feel like something's wrong, but you don't quite know what it is. From one scene to the next, the seasons sort of appear to change. Technology is another weird one. We don't know what time period we're in. There's sort of cars from the 70s, they're watching shows from the 50s, and then they've got this sort of weird technology that can't really be placed and doesn't have a place in our world. And all this stuff just feels weird, and it never lets you, like, I suppose, anchor onto anything.
When it comes to good horror, then an element of bewilderment is essential in actually building up tension for the player. And even though that is frustrating in a way, I think that when players have clear goals in horror games, that undercuts the horror, because there's now there's a very clear, I'm safe as soon as paradigm. Whereas in Amnesia, coming back to that, the moments where that game is the most successful is when the levels are quite open. And finding the essential letter or the key or something is a little bit harder, and that makes you have to go back and forth. And when you know that the monster is there, that's where there's a real sense of tension. So I think when you're lost, when the levels aren't linear, when you're forced to do uncomfortable things, that's where you can like force people to experience horror.
And what's so funny about it in hindsight is if you actually look at the kind of distances you cross in the levels in Amnesia, it's like minuscule, you know.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to, there's one kitchen level I particularly like remember where all the lights have gone out and you're just aware of how little resource you have for lighting and how much it costs you just to move from one space to another. So by that time you're so used to how terrifying just moving is that it's sort of the process of walking across a kitchen that in any other FPS might take like a couple of seconds and no thought at all becomes this like huge terrifying task, and you're hiding behind things, and you're like, you know, it just has built up so much tension in you.
And this sounds counterintuitive for a lot of designers who'll be like, good level design is everything. You know, you need to have good level design, and I suppose in a way it is good level design. But I think about a kitchen level that you play in, I think it's the Evil Within 1, and there's a very clear path that the player is meant to take to survive this kitchen of chaos kind of situation. And I wasn't scared. I was frustrated because there was a right answer and it was just trial and error to get there. That wasn't a scary experience. Where I agree, like that kitchen in Amnesia was scary because you could pick any route through it, but it was making steps forward that was anxious.
I'm not even sure there was anything in that particular kitchen level or in that segment that I'm thinking about that was even after you. It was just you were so naturally caught up in the world and the vulnerability that you're counting your steps carefully kind of thing. Whereas, I mean, I suppose we lead on to stealth in that regard because Amnesia kind of was what inspired something like Alien Isolation, and that we've all like ranted about how the stealth elements in that are just become really frustrating, and a couple of failed tries because the AI is just too kind of unforgiving there.
But that's the thin line that all horror games need to work between how aware of the mechanics do you make the player. I'm not exactly sure what the answers are in that space, but I do think that there's ways of adding tension, even in non-horror games, that I think is a really cool place to then use stuff like jump scares or uncomfortable moments to actually inspire horror. And in Dark Souls, it's not a horror game in any sense. But when you are playing the game for the first time, there is a tangible sense of fear that you don't know what you're going to experience next. And you wager progress against the souls that you have in your collection because you could easily lose them, and you know how hard it was to get to where you are. So in horror games, I think when you also wager a lot on progress, you've got that tension. It is a really viable place to then add in the kind of horror that we see with the monsters or with other things. And segueing onto that, I think one of the things that actually really hurts modern horror games is that in most games now we expect quick saves and we expect to be able to put down the controller and pick up where we left off, which is great for most other games, and especially for more casual players. But in horror, when you're able to not lose any progress by dying, the risk of dying becomes pointless, and then the horror is sucked out of, or the horror and the tension is sucked out of situations. And I think I had that in Resident Evil 7, where I was having an amazing experience, and then I died. And then I went back 5 steps, and I was like, oh, easy peasy. And I breezed through the stuff that I had done, now knowing that if I die, it's not a big deal.
If you're dying a lot and you're just able to get right back there, it does definitely diminish from that sense of it. It makes it, I think, a little bit more interesting to die, and Dark Souls a little bit more fun.
Think about something like the early Thief games, where even though they weren't horror games, had a very, very tangible sense of fear. Because there was so much at risk. You don't know what might be around the next corner. You don't know how like reckless you can be at any point in time. And so I think when you just make it too easy to navigate the environments, you don't have that nervousness about dying.
Again, you weren't playing horror games. You had things to collect. You had people to avoid and that sort of thing. So, you were vulnerable and you were lost a lot of the time in exploring the space. And you seldom, because these environments were so big and like wonderfully like detailed and stuff, you never really kind of got on top of them and felt like you really were like the master of this level. You were vulnerable, but of course you get some sense of power when you evaded guards and things. But that game never really like made you can never fight any of them, which is what a lot of modern stealth screw up.
It's what the modern Thief also really screwed up. It was too easy to dispense guards.
Yeah, exactly. So So I mean, I do. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of these of adding unexpected horror into games like Thief. I mean, in a way, you could argue it's not horror, but it's quite tense.
Yeah.
And then they go the supernatural route at some point in that game, and then it really feels like horror. And all they're doing is making these monsters that, I think, with one tangible difference, you can't knock them out from behind. So now you're really screwed. Now you really have to avoid them.
Yeah.
And they're pretty scary, even in their kind of glorious 200 polygon detail. They still, it's in some sort of way, it still holds up.
I tend to agree. A lot of older horror experiences do hold up better than modern ones. And it's not because modern games don't have the ability to express these things, but it's because modern audiences, I think, expect a certain amount of immediacy. They expect a certain amount of like the game not wasting their time.
Yeah.
And that makes it a little bit harder for developers to make scary experiences because people don't want to be frustrated in the experience. And like frustration, I think, is core to a lot of horror.
Yeah, definitely.
And then this comes back to what I was first wondering is, what is more important to audiences? Is it more important that a game be fun and have a horror theme, or a game be truly terrifying and uncomfortable, but not fun necessarily?
Yeah, they're definitely the different types of horror that work. I mean, so without a doubt, something like Resident Evils is something that it still spooks people and still gets under people's skin and freaks them out, even though you do have this very kind of militarized, powerful character. I wouldn't like to see only horror games that were things like Amnesia. I mean, I loved it, but it's sort of too much in a way. You want things that give you this pacing and these breaths in between where you can be safe and calm down, and kind of that coupled with the kind of mechanical tension of managing your resources and your ammo and stuff like that is. I think there's definitely a place for those games.
So if you had an ideal horror game, what would you make?
I'd probably try and make something like Amnesia and just really make something truly like horrible and unpleasant and freak someone out. I don't know though. I mean, the degree to which Amnesia freaks people out is the production quality of Amnesia. I mean, the sound design is absolutely incredible. If you're just walking through that house and you stop and you just listen, there's all this little detail. This must be like a half-hour-long looping ambience track in the background that's just got little knocks and screams and terrifying things happening, but they're really subtle, and all of that stuff just adds up in Amnesia to make this like incredibly polished and terrifying experience. And I think like in the example of the kitchen thing, that shows that hopefully most players get to a point where they're so engaged in the experience that they don't need to worry about the mechanics of it. You can put nothing in front of them and they're still shit scared about what might be there. Maybe I'd make something like that. What would you make?
Well, I'm a huge fan of those early PS2 horrors, which was like Fatal Frame and Silent Hill and everything. And all of them took place with like very character-driven stories, and the character was always, in a way, a foil for the horror. And so when I think about that, I think about something that is over the shoulder, where you do assume a character role, but then there's some kind of haunted house scenario. So I would like to have a kind of Groundhog Day horror where there is a perfect way to solve this house, but you need to also uncover the mystery of why exactly you're in this kind of like wake up, die experience. And I think that's a vehicle for like Lovecraftian themes.
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know if you've played Stories Untold. Stories Untold does that amazingly. It's one of my favorite recent, I guess you could call it horror. It's kind of a bit more mystery, heavy narrative stuff, but certain events repeat themselves in the game, and they twist things on their head, and you're basically uncovering the story through these really cool interactive little scenes. So if you could do something like that where your entire expectation changes when you come back, that would be a cool thing to see in a game where you would otherwise be powerful. So
just change things slightly enough that they feel kind of uncomfortable. I think that I'm not sure, but I think it's an interesting place where you could perhaps like add in tension and horror that the player wasn't expecting. And I think that's the best way to get horror into games, is just make sure the players aren't expecting what comes next.
I wonder what everyone else thinks about this topic, and about what sort of interesting things make a good horror game, and some other examples of really good horror games in terms of what we've been talking about. Be interesting to hear about that.
What's up, you guys?
I just want to point out too, while we're on camera, this is the perfect setting for a horror talk, because we got steam. I don't know if you can see that on camera.
That's amazing.
It's so fucking freezing.
Spooky stories around the fire.
Yeah, exactly.